What happens to your paper savings when the central banks that print the money quietly stop trusting their own system? Right now, behind closed doors, at the highest level of global finance, an event has just occurred for the first time in modern monetary history. For nearly 8 years, the US dollar and US Treasuries were the golden standard for global reserves. But according to newly released data, sovereign central banks around the world now hold virtually as much physical gold in their vaults as they do in US Treasuries, with gold reserves crossing over $3.9 trillion. Now, this isn't a theoretical conspiracy, and it isn't a social media rumor. It's a structural shift in how nations trade, price energy, and store national wealth. The US dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves has quietly slid from over 71% down to 57%. This is its lowest reading in over 3 decades. At the same time, BRICS Alliance has launched pilot trials for the Unit, a gold-anchored cross-border trade settlement network designed specifically to bypass the Western banking system. Now, to understand why the global monetary system is resetting today, we have to look at the invisible plumbing that has controlled the world since 1944. At the Bretton Woods conference near the end of World War II, delegates from 44 nations made a deal. The US dollar would be pegged to physical gold at $35 an ounce, and every other global currency would be pegged to the US dollar. Because America owned nearly 2/3 of the world's gold at the time, the world was willing to agree to this. Now, that system worked until August 15th, 1971, when President Richard Nixon officially severed the dollar's link to gold to prevent foreign nations from cashing in their paper greenbacks for American bullion.
In recent weeks, the speculators have been waging an all-out war on the American dollar. Accordingly, I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to take the action necessary to defend the dollar against the speculators. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets.
Overnight, the world entered into an unbacked fiat experiment. But the dollar didn't crash, and you may be wondering why. In 1974, Washington forged a critical alliance with Saudi Arabia, creating what's known as the Petrodollar system. Now, this deal was brilliant, but now the plumbing is starting to crack. The catalyst that turned gradual de-dollarization into an emergency corporate and sovereign priority happened in February 2022. This was when Western governments froze over $300 billion in Russian sovereign central bank assets and disconnected major banks from the SWIFT international messaging system. It sent a shockwave through non-aligned finance ministers worldwide. Regardless of the geopolitical context, sovereign leaders realized a terrifying truth. If your nation's reserves are stored in digital foreign debt, those assets can be turned off with the click of a button in Washington or Brussels. Now take a look at what central bank behavior did following that stark realization. Prior to 2022, central banks bought an average of 400 to 500 tons of gold per year. In 2022, that number more than doubled to over 1,000 tons. Nations like China, India, Poland, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia didn't just buy gold to diversify. They bought it because physical gold carries zero counterparty risk. It cannot be sanctioned, frozen, or digitally erased by a foreign central bank. And that brings us to the shocking metric that I mentioned earlier. For 4 decades, US Treasuries were considered a risk-free asset, and this formed the bedrock of global bank balance sheets. But today, the total dollar value of physical gold sitting in central bank vaults has surged to nearly equal all foreign-held US Treasuries. A new international monetary architecture is being quietly built in the background. The The BRICS coalition, which now represents roughly 45% of the world's population, has officially shifted from talking about de-dollarization to implementing a working infrastructure. Enter the unit. Unlike traditional central bank fiat currency, the unit is not designed to replace your paper money for expenses like the grocery store. It's a specialized trade settlement framework designed specifically for cross-border e-commerce between member nations. This is how it works. The unit's value is anchored to a hybrid model, 40% physical gold and 60% a basket of member nation currencies. When China buys crude oil from the UAE or agricultural goods from Brazil, they don't convert yuan to US dollars through Western banks. They clear the trade directly through local clearing systems like China's CIPS or multi-CBDC platforms like mBridge using units. The result is completely removing the need to convert currency to US dollars in New York or the use of the SWIFT system. Now, if the unit captures only 10 to 15% of global trade transactions over the coming years, it represents hundreds of billions of trade volume that no longer requires holding US dollar cash or buying US Treasury bills. When the global demand for reserve currency declines, the issuing nation loses its ability to export inflation to the rest of the world. So how does the global monetary shift show up in your day-to-day life? If foreign central banks reduce their net purchases of US Treasuries, someone else has to buy the trillions of dollars in new bonds Washington issues every year to fund its budget deficit. Now, this leaves the US system with two possible outcomes. One is higher yields for longer. To attract private buyers and replace foreign central banks, the US government must offer significantly higher interest rates on its debt. Outcome number two is the Fed debt monetization. In this situation, the Federal Reserve steps in as the buyer of last resort, printing money to buy the treasury debt that foreign buyers no longer want. This is why tangible assets from gold and silver to infrastructure, housing, and product capital equities have experienced aggressive revaluations. Investors are pricing in a world where fiat currency debasement is used as the path of least resistance to manage sovereign debt burdens. Now, a monetary reset is rarely a sudden thing where overnight paper money just turns to dust. History shows it's a multi-year, quiet transition where old rules stop working and capital moves towards hard, uncounterpartied assets. The rules that generated wealth over the last 40 years, like holding long-term paper debt, relying on zero interest rate liquidity, and assuming dollar dominance was permanent, are giving way to multi-currency, commodity-backed economic landscapes. So as you review your allocations, here is the core question I want you to ask. If the largest, most sophisticated sovereign financial institutions in the world are steadily reducing their exposure to sovereign debt and stacking physical assets at record speeds, is your portfolio positioned for the old system or the one being built right now?